thank you very much. I'm very happy with this invitation, especially now that I live in Norway. So it's good to be back, and also interesting to hear the Danish take on what's going on, which is not so different though from the Norwegian. Yeah, a lot of things are happening, as we all know at the moment. It can be a little bit hard to predict things, but basically I'm going to argue that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is going to strengthen some tendencies that were already there, mostly, rather than, make a huge sort of, it's not going to change a lot to tendencies that were already there if you look at the US-China-Europe triangle, in my opinion. But we can debate that, of course. At this moment, nothing is certain because we don't really know the outcome of the war. And I think that's important too for what's going to take place. But anyway, I will deal with the Ukraine issue as we go along rather than sort of take it in the beginning. So essentially what I'm going to talk about is the US-China strategic competition and how that sort of influences Europe. What is Europe's response to what's going on? And what is going on is, first of all, that there is an enhanced US focus on Asian allies and partners. I don't think that has changed during the invasion of the Ukraine. In fact, I'm surprised at how much attention the US maintains in a way on the Indo-Pacific during the war. But I guess their assessment is they've told the Europeans what would happen. Look here, what's going on, take action. Yeah. So I stay a lot in touch with the US, including intelligence sources, and their assessment is that even if there were to be, which won't happen now, most likely, but could happen some years from now, were to be an attack on a NATO country, it's very debatable that the US is willing to present Europe with ground forces or anything like that. What I hear is that they will send weapons, they will train forces, etc., as they have always done and as they're doing now. But the sort of days where the US would become involved in heavily involved in a European war are most likely over, because there simply isn't much backing in the US domestic scene for that. So even if some of the policymakers may think that they should do more in Europe, the US domestic politics is such that is not what is likely to happen. That's not the trend. The trend is that the US public can understand that China is a threat towards the US, economic well-being, their position in the world, etc. And so it's bipartisan to do something about that. But there isn't much appetite for getting involved in Europe, especially since the American perception, I guess rightly so, is that Europe has not been willing to prioritize defense issues and spend money on that. And so there is not much understanding, I find, in the US for, why should they come and save Europe, so to speak, sadly. So, and I think during this crisis, the US published its Indo-Pacific strategy, which is a key document, and that was in the run-up to the war. Blinken went to Asia for a whole week to show China that, we have our eye on the ball, and the problem is you. And we're not going to take our eyes away from you. Right now, there is a delegation of would-be President Pompeo, Evan Medeiros, who's a very influential man in the Democrats. They're all in Taiwan. And so the US is really signaling in so many ways that they're going to continue to sort of slowly, gradually focus more and more on their Asian allies and partners and on the threats that come out of China. China focuses on implementing its Silk Road model for economic growth and development across the world. True to form, it stays fairly quiet when there's a war that, that might make them look bad. But given that it's really important for them to sort of stress non-interference because of their sort of claim to Xinjiang province and the things that goes on there, the Tibet issue, the Hong Kong issue, and all these things. And of course, that makes it problematic for them to support Russia. I think they have been very supportive of Russia, given their, strong dislike of the use of force in this way, and the fact that it can compromise some of China's own positions politically and give them serious problems with the West, which they don't necessarily want. But they are still backing Russia. They're saying it's the West's fault, this invasion. They're calling it a war, but they're not calling it an invasion. But again, note that in the US, there is a big debate about this. And I think that's again because the US is again focused on China, and this kind of link between Russia and China, there is some skepticism still in a lot of quarters in the US. And I don't know why, but I'm thinking it's also because Russia is lower on the bucket list, frankly, still. But I failed to see the arguments as to, the people who argue that China and Russia are going to split. I'm sure even if China is forced to sort of say things they don't really want to say about Russia in public, in private, this cooperation will definitely continue. Today it's all-encompassing in loads of key strategic sectors. They're a really good match for each other, and China can now get its way with Russia, probably, with a lot of projects where Russia was backtracking because they don't want to be China's puppy. I think now China has a good chance, for example, some of the Arctic projects, that it can say, we're willing to pay for it, so you can go ahead. And I find it hard to see that they would give up that connection, frankly. Also, financially, this strengthens China's ability to float the yuan as a reserve currency and push out the dollar. It also makes it possible for China to introduce its payment systems, replacing those that rely on the dollar. So there's a lot of arguments as to why China should continue to cooperate in all these areas, in lots of areas with Russia. So China will still focus on implementing its Silk Road model for economic growth and development. And it will do that in the part of the world that is not Western, and that is much more where the regimes, not necessarily the population, is much more prone to this authoritarian kind of model. Where does that leave Europe? Well, in my view, it leaves Europe with two choices: either to develop an autonomous global economic and security footprint, including its own defense capability. If we don't, then I think Europe, and there is tendencies to that in my opinion, will fragment, I think, into different parts, because different parts of Europe have different threat perceptions. So the North may move very close to the US. We can see that already happening. It may not necessarily mean that the US will come, but that seems to be the best bet for the Northern European countries, whereas other countries in the South may go for different alliances down the road. So I think either fragmentation or more unity in Europe is really the choices we face. I don't think it's a choice to sort of reignite the transatlantic relationship and bet on that, because as I said, the US domestic politics really makes it too dangerous to sort of go down that route for Europe, in my assessment. So there are some dilemmas for Europe. With regard to the US, there is this dilemma of abandonment versus entrapment, which means that on the one hand, US allies are afraid that the US will not honor its security guarantees and that it will, basically not come to our rescue. The UK assessment of that is that you have to deliver more on China and the Indo-Pacific. The UK, for them, Russia is the bigger threat, and they don't have a super good economy either, but they're an outlier out of the European Union. And they have gone all in, I think, in the Indo-Pacific, stationing ships there, sending their carrier, etc. And they do that because they think that's the price for credible US security guarantees. So that's the fear of abandonment. But most of Europe it may change with the Ukraine, but it doesn't really change the conclusion, though. But there is also a fear of entrapment, which is, to be dragged into military conflicts, for example, that Europe doesn't want to be part of. And that's very high on the European agenda, because with regard to the Taiwan issue, I think all the US diplomats have been instructed, well, maybe not this month, but even this month, because they're themselves going to Taiwan, all the diplomats have been instructed every time they visit a European capital or Brussels, they will put really significant pressure on Europe to deliver more on Taiwan, for example, than we do. And Europe is not happy with that, because they don't want to, we're going to leave all the questions till the end, so they will.
What means by deliver on Taiwan? Could you specify that?
Well, they ask, can you do more? So, for example, they would like to see, I think, more of a military presence, sail-throughs and etc. And we are doing that, not as the European Union, but individual countries. But Europe's response has been, okay, we can give China a harder time on international law. That's what the EU is planning to do. So calling China's bluff with regard to their interpretation of the international law when you compare their behavior in the South China Sea to their behavior in the Arctic, how they ignore that Philippine case that was before the Hague Court. That sort of thing, that's what Brussels says, we can give you this, but America wants more. And they're not happy with what's delivered. So that again stresses US priorities, and that it's a problem because before this war, there was a lot of people who worried about a Taiwan war, and there still is, because, and I think rightly so, not at this point in time, but China will be watching what happens in the Ukraine. And if Russia is reasonably successful in holding at least part of the territory. And if Russia continues to keep sort of European, at least, attention on Eastern Europe, which I think they will, then China has more of a free hand, it hopes, in its home region, where, of course, it's trying to push out the Americans as much as possible. And down the line, that may suddenly make it feasible for China to take over Taiwan by force. That is why the US is constantly signaling that we've got you, we're on you, we don't forget you, unfortunately. But who knows if that's going to last. So the issue of a Taiwan war is still very much up in the minds of strategic planners in Washington, that's for sure. With regard to China, for Europe, there is the dilemma of deterrence versus détente, I would say. So on the one hand, with Trump's sort of calling China's bluff, Europe has now agrees that China is also, if not a threat, then at least a challenge to Europe because of its market economic malpractices. At least that's the way the US and the EU sees it. And so on the one hand, Europe is trying increasingly to defend itself against Chinese joint ventures, copying of European advanced designs, etc. All these things that we've heard about. But I'm not sure that so much is happening on the ground, frankly speaking. So there is a lot of instruments in the toolbox. So if you read the European Union, webpage, it looks like they're doing a lot. But I'm not so sure how much has actually been implemented, to be honest. At least this is still ongoing. And I can say that because I've just done a paper on the shipbuilding industry. And this is with people in the shipbuilding industry. They're my source who experience these things. And they say that absolutely zero has been done about this. So I'm just saying, still an issue, but we're getting to do something. But on the other hand, of course, Europe is not willing to appoint China as sort of all-out enemy. And although I think Europe is very worried about China's behavior during the Ukraine war, I don't think they will change that policy because, they're going to have enough to deal with Russia. They don't need to pronounce China an enemy right now. So I don't think that policy will change in the foreseeable future either. So they have this dilemma. Europe, on the one hand, China is a bad guy in some ways, but on the other hand, we still want to cooperate with them on nice two issues such as climate, etc. Although even if China always pays lip service to climate in the agreements, they don't do much about it in practice. But maybe that will change. So that is sort of the overall argument. And I will talk in a little bit more detail about this. I would argue, which may sound a bit strange to some, but I would argue that Europe's policy, as is the case in the rest of the world, is becoming much more interest-based rather than value-based. Ironically, the more we hear about the importance of democracy, human rights, the less it matters. I don't think it matters at all because the assessment is you can't really afford to take this too seriously. So while we talk a lot about, and rightly so, about China's and Russia's human rights and democracy violations, we are trying to partner up with Vietnam, and that is not very different from what goes on in China. And we partner up with India, who, although it is a democracy, also have very, very serious human rights issues today, and also democratic problems. And this is just a few examples, because we compete with China for partners and allies. And in that game, we cannot afford, is the assessment. I'm not saying what's right or wrong, I'm just saying what I see. We cannot afford, is the assessment, to care too much about that. So as much as it's talked about democratic alliances, I don't think that really plays much of a role at all. It's power politics, it's interests. And the EU and Europe is then forced also to consider what are our interests and how do we pursue them. So the EU follows some of what the US does, but it does so autonomously, I would argue. So for example, Europe tries to diversify the countries it partner up with. And it does so not only to sort of not be too dependent on China with regard to rare earths, etc., but also not to be too dependent on the United States. And that's why in France, during this war as well, there was a big Indo-Pacific summit where the US and China were not invited, because Europe needs its own relations, for example, to Japan, because Europe doesn't have the same interest with these countries as the US or China does. For example, Japan also feels it needs to have ongoing cooperation with China because it's a neighboring country. The US doesn't really like that, so it doesn't flag that up too much. And Japanese population is also very sort of, anti-Chinese, or whatever you'd say, focused on the China threat. But still, there are some in some ways, it needs Europe as well. And also, of course, when Trump sort of ditched free trade agreements, Japan and EU did an enormous big package of free trade agreements that actually had very positive effects pretty quickly on these two actors' economies. So for these reasons, just to give a few examples, Europe is looking for its own relationships to shape. So what we're also heading towards, haven't written that down, I think is very clearly multipolarity. I think Russia's behavior shows that, the EU's behavior. The US is recognizing the EU now as a key actor in the Indo-Pacific. That's not bipolarity. I'm not sure that's good, because I also think it comes with more wars, more instability, because multipolarity is much more unpredictable. But it gives the middle powers, if you like, more room to navigate and to influence what is going on. So, we could say that's a good thing, but the less good thing might be that we might see more violent conflict between countries, more wars, more uncertainty. So, Europe's power is, or its claim to fame is, of course, that it's an economic heavyweight and that cannot be ignored. The US is Europe's biggest trade partner, and China is Europe's second biggest trade partner. And the EU has learned to begin to use that power. For example, as I said, making or negotiating and making a free trade agreement with Japan right in the face of the Trump administration. That is an example of how they use their economic weight to say, you may think that, but we're going this way. So I think Europe is starting to use that, and that's why the US can no longer, this has happened under Trump, I think as well, they cannot afford to ignore Brussels. They used to just talk to the main capitals in Europe, but now they talk to everyone, because, including the European Union, because they understand that it wields significant power. Yeah. So that is what really gives Europe the opportunity to be a sort of autonomous pole, if you like. Is there hope for transatlantic cooperation in NATO? I think it's very worrying. I don't think the security guarantees, a lot of people, I can say, or a lot of countries in our part of the world realize that the NATO guarantees as such are not worth much, and that's why you see a lot of countries making specific bilateral agreements with the United States. Of course, you can also count that as NATO, but it is a reflection of skepticism that the NATO security guarantees are worth anything. And that's not good, because that sort of is could be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So it can undermine NATO and bring them where they don't want to be. So I think it's a dangerous policy, but also an understandable policy, at least for the frontline states. And I live in one. I actually don't think you do. I think this is not the front line, but Norway is. And that's because northern Norway, Russia has all the stuff it needs to hit the US homeland is up there in the Arctic. And so in case of a military conflict, it's very likely that Russia would invade northern Norway. That is not a sort of weird scenario. That is especially now something that Norway needs to think about. And so, seen from their perspective, it's understandable. They're not an EU member either, that they're looking for US security guarantees and are also more likely to get them because they are exposed to Russian threats. But you can't say that about all of Europe, I guess. And the thing is, Norway is important to the US, of course, because Russia can hit the US homeland from up there, etc. So Norway is a bit different, but that's not the case for all of us. Nevertheless, I do believe there is a lot of complementarity between the US and Europe. So in a perfect world, they should be able to reignite their relations and find ways, we'll see with the upcoming strategic review, to make the most of the complementarity, which is obviously there between the two, even if they have different views. You could still argue that even if Europe or is better at diplomacy and the US is better at hard power, whatever, they can often unite the two, at least behind the scenes, even if some of Europe's partners are disliked by the US. For example, the Arab League is a partner of the EU. The US wouldn't dream of negotiating with them. But that means Europe can solve some problems for the US that it cannot do itself politically because of Israel. And so in that sense, there's a lot of issues which may seem conflictual, but if you think about it and the fact that a lot of the stuff in public is not the same as behind the scenes, there is a lot of complementarity, and there is also cooperation between the US and Europe that we don't see, fortunately. So sometimes it looks worse than it is. And so I think the best we can hope for is that will be the outcome, and that NATO will sort of be redefined in a way that makes both parties, back it up. But I have my doubts, I must admit. And it's unfortunate because I think Europe is the only one who really shares the liberal values of the US to a large extent. In Asia, it's not really shared. It's very thin commitment to liberal values. So they can't use them for that. Again, values don't matter. And that's another, because they still prioritize the Indo-Pacific. Okay, let's revisit the security policy. Gradually, the US, I think, will continue to transfer resources from Europe to the Indo-Pacific. The US has sent a few thousand extra troops during this war. The opinion polls, I think, are not very encouraging. There was like a 40% that thought it was a good idea to send a few thousand troops to NATO countries, to show that, we're here and don't invade them. I think that's not a lot. 37% were not sure what they thought about that, and more than, I think it was 25 or something, thought it was a bad idea. That's not good numbers for such a very small contribution, I think. And just to say, I think this trend will continue, and I think US clearly signals that that's the long term. They're going to focus on the Indo-Pacific. The US has also withdrawn, much to our dismay, now that Russia is threatening to use nuclear weapons. Withdrawn from the IMF treaty because of China wasn't part of it. There's an arms race, in my opinion. Some people say there isn't, some people say there. I think there's clearly an arms race, including a nuclear arms race going on. And that, of course, is difficult for the EU because they don't have, again, their autonomous armed forces, nothing to speak of. So that's not so good. And in Europe's opinion, of course, this has made, the climate worse. US behavior has. There's the China strategic partnership with Russia. I've already covered that. I think it will be much stronger in practice on the ground than we've seen before. Maybe not in public, but again, most things are not the same on the ground as what they say in public. And unless Russia really, if Putin falls or something, of course, it may be different, although I think we'll just get another Putin, frankly, so I'm not sure that will change anything. So I think the most likely is that this will take off because China can really use Russia to speed up the implementation of the Silk Road. US withdrawal from nuclear deal with Iran. It's also a bit unfortunate because they have a lot of oil and gas. But again, making them unpopular with Europe. The European presence in the South China Sea, it has started, but it's not really enough, as I said, in the eyes of the US. So Europe's response has been, as mentioned before, to establish autonomous relations with Asian partners and also the new institutions such as the quadrilateral security dialogue between Australia, India, the US, and Japan. And France has been a quasi-member of that for a number of years now, since the beginning. But it's not officially a member because it can't be, because it's, it has to respect the European Union. But yeah, so Europe is also getting involved in these new fora. And that's wise because those fora will be the fora where the important decisions will be taken in future. And that's why the European Union does this, establishes relations with, for example, the Quad. It will not be taken in the post-World War II institutions. And the reason is, I think, in a way, quite simple. They're based on consensus, and you cannot operate with institutions that are based on consensus in a global environment that shifts as quickly as this does. This is also characteristic of emerging multipolarity. Things shift very quickly. And you can't sit there every time and wait for number one who doesn't want sanctions against Russia or doesn't want to take on China as a threat or whatever. That's no good. And the EU itself And the only reason why the EU is different from the other post-war institutions is that it has renewed itself and it's not relying on consensus anymore. As you can see, it moves very, very quickly. And it's the European Council. If you look at how the EU works, basically, Commission is thinking long-term and planning the long-term instruments. But it's the European Council, so it's the heads of states that gets all the shitty problems. They end up there. Brexit, the Ukraine war is something the European Council has to deal with, and they move pretty quickly by now. So they go beyond this consensus, heavy-going bureaucratic system, and that's why the EU is relatively important still. Defense cooperation, there's a lot of initiatives, plans. They may take off now that Germany has sort of made a bit of a jump in deciding to spend more on defense, which was a long time coming. They have sent a warship to the Indo-Pacific. They have gone along with the French line to some extent, but now it will be, a lot more, go a lot quicker, which I think is very good news because I think it's simply necessary. As I said, I don't think we can go to anyone else for help with this. But the question is if it's soon enough and early enough. I'm sure that Russia won't, I can't be sure, but one of Putin's assessment must have been if he doesn't act now, it's going to be too late for them. We don't have any military, and NATO is like, they can't, they're totally immobile. But that may change, one can hope, especially with regard to Europe's defense. Indo-Pacific, French-led European presence with the US as a primary partner from 21, supported by a European Union strategy. So the EU recognizes the need to stay in the Indo-Pacific, and I think they will stay. They won't leave. They won't decide, okay, now we can only handle Russia. Because again, we can't really afford that. They go together. So if China-Russia cooperation is strengthened, it's a very bad idea to sort of just skip the Indo-Pacific. And also because we have, as I mentioned, a lot of partners that would strengthen us through cooperation: Japan, South Korea, India, etc. And that's why the EU will keep its focus on the Indo-Pacific. So, economically, as I mentioned, China's market economic practices has been a problem. WTO is not really an efficient instrument, as all the other institutions. It's stuck. And, the verdicts come way too late. A lot of the companies have died or moved on when they come out with their decisions, so that's not so useful. There's a trade imbalance continuously with the US that favors Europe, and even if that has sort of been downtoned a bit, it's still an issue in the US that they're not happy about, because President Biden's, one of his big jobs is to get the US economy thriving. And so this is, again, it's not very popular in the US public. Then there's the data protection focus of Europe. There's tech sovereignty issues that continues to mar the US-Europe agenda. They do have an ongoing cooperation on cyber and also on trade that we hope solve some of the problems, but I don't think again this difference in agenda will go away, and it will again make it more difficult for US and Europe to forge meaningful cooperation on these essential issues. Then there's also the issue of technology standards and licenses. That's very important because that's a way of excluding countries from your markets. So China is progressing with establishing its own standards. And so if you're not a Belt and Road country, basically you won't get access to what you need to meet those standards, or you'll be excluded from it. And so that's going to be a problem as sort of the world, diverts into, goes away from these global standards that Europe has put its bet on. I don't think that's viable. Hope Europe doesn't think that either. So that's going to be a problem because Europe is a latecomer to realizing this. And these export control mechanisms, they're not always working. So they're mainly directed at China, I guess, or the ones we hear most about. Of course, in principle, they're directed at everyone, but they don't always work. And that's also the case for the United States, because it is very difficult to control all these different economic actors today and all their, network around the globe. So it is very difficult. So also Europe will often say to the US, you don't stick to your own rules yourself, even though you sound tough in the mouth. So, so these are some of the challenges. I think Europe will continue to sort of deal with China principally by diplomatic instruments, but also with growing skepticism towards China's intentions. Industrial policy, there is a need to revisit that. As I said, it's ongoing that China copies ship designs from Europe. And what China does, of course, is that the state throws loads of money after the industries that are considered strategic. They build factories and they're dual use. So where they build commercial ships, they will also build naval ships. And this is not some small thing, because I think China has around 60% of global shipbuilding market. And number two, I don't remember the exact figures. Number two is South Korea. They may have 17%. And it's just getting worse and worse and worse. And Maersk buys all its tankers in China. So there is no, not much awareness of this or concern about it. Nothing is done. And soon we have to buy warships in China. And I don't think that's desirable. So this is really big problems, not just economically, but also from a security and defense perspective. And then Europe, especially our own commissioner has focused a lot also on the maintaining internal competition in Europe. But the problem, somewhat I would argue, is that they don't allow the mergers that could actually compete with these massive Chinese companies. And that's a problem, because we do need to compete globally now, not just in our own region. So there is some competition rules that are a problem, I would argue. We're talking about having standardized rules for AI, artificial intelligence applications. That would be an important move because, again, that would help Europe have a unified policy and strategy. The Belt and Road doesn't have a huge presence in Europe, but China's malpractices does have a huge presence because they're acquiring key companies like engine producers and that kind of thing. So in that sense, China does have a huge economic presence. But the Belt and Road itself is not, in fact, one of the reasons that it's 16, now 17+1 project in Eastern Europe, splintering the EU fell apart, I guess, was that there wasn't, in fact, enough investments. Europe also has connectivity projects as alternatives to Chinese Silk Road in Asia, and they will have been launched lately, even more of those. So we don't know how that ends, if it's going to be successful, but it requires private sector money, I think, also to be a success. And it remains to be seen if they succeed in coupling those two. That's also the case with the US plans to offer alternatives to the Belt and Road. Normatively, Europe, as mentioned before, they prefer soft power, whereas US, mainly because they only have soft power, and the US often prefers hard power. More of concern is that there's a new multilateralism emerging, which the US is really plugged into. Europe less so, but increasingly so. And that's what I mentioned with the Quad, the trilateral corporations that you find in the Indo-Pacific. So they're like small fora with a sort of limited agenda usually. And they're small because, it doesn't take many actors to stop everything. So that's why you see a proliferation of smaller fora with sort of a more limited agenda than these big agendas of the United Nations and the World Trade Organization. And that's, I think, is the future, and that's something Europe needs to plug into. You talked about Europe seeing both challenges and opportunities in China's growing role in multilateral fora. I think they see more challenges, but they're hard put to deal with it sometimes in Europe. Europe prefers to work within NATO on transatlantic cooperation, but the reality of that is not so great, so they have to do other things. I'll finish in a minute. Traditionally, Europe is seen as the principal defender of liberal human rights and democracy, but as we know, Poland, Hungary, others are challenging that perception. I see it actually, this may sound, but putting it sort of to a bit extreme, I think it's a sign of health because there's much more interest in the European Union today. We don't always treat our members equally. Some members are sometimes treated a bit like B members, and that sometimes causes a reaction within the European Union, which I think we have to learn to deal with. There is growing authoritarian populism in Europe, but there's also a lot more focus on Europe. And with that, there will be more voices within Europe and a broader spectrum of opinion. And seeing that it's fairly democratic compared to so many other things, and you can vote for the European Parliament and all these things, well, yeah, there will be voices we don't like and we don't feel they fit in with democracy and human rights. But after all, it's a sign of health that they make themselves known. And I think bottom line is that it's out of the question that Hungary and Poland would leave the European Union. And they work with the others in the European Council on a day-to-day basis. So actually, I think this is not a big problem for the European Union. There's a lot of support for European cooperation. And so I think the EU will continue to play a role. And I think it will be strengthened actually by what goes on in the Ukraine down the line. So that's good. So the conclusion is, I think China is an unacceptable partner because of its increased militarization in its home region, but also functionally, across all the commons like cyberspace, sea, air, which is we don't like that, of course, and it works with Russia to do that. It has a model with extensive social control, which is unacceptable to Europe, which we also don't like. And it has a disrespect for the sanctity of agreements. So it's happy to sign all kinds of agreements that sounds nice, but what we've experienced is that rarely does it honor those agreements. It doesn't really care that it doesn't stick to the rules. And Europe finds it very hard to deal with that because we are very sort of agreements and rules-based order. So how even to, that's another topic for the EU to determine. How can we cooperate with a unit that doesn't feel it's important to respect written agreements is actually quite a challenge. The US is also unreliable. The decoupling tendencies, although we do some of that too, we more diversify. Of course, Russia is not something we want to deal with now, but I'm sure that will return at some point. We do need to speak to the Russians again. In fact, we probably should have spoken to them a long time ago if NATO could have agreed to do that, but they could not because there are some countries who didn't want to in the East. So those decoupling tendencies go too far in the US. We don't want to decouple from China like they do, and that will set us apart. The US also has these oligopolies, like those big Amazon, Google, and all those, with a special global position, which is also, not to Europe's taste. We may have to change our opinion on that, as I said, because we may also need some of those big global companies to stay competitive. But for now, we don't like that, and we're fighting it with peaceful means. And then we also don't like total competition with China. And that's not going to change now that Russia is making itself known in an unpleasant way in Europe. So I think, again, the choices are European autonomy, or, which can also happen, a divided region where the countries will act on different perceptions of what is threatening them and try to hook up with different actors depending on where they see the threats coming from, which would seriously undermine, I think, the European Union. So that was the words. I hope it was interesting, and I'm happy to discuss any of this with you.